Thank you so much. Should have cleared my throat before the recording started, but I will share the PowerPoint real quick. All right, can everyone see like the presentation mode of the PowerPoint?
Yes, it looks good.
Okay, great. All right, so thank you so much, Kati, for that really nice introduction. I'm Carolien Mossel, and I'm here with Max Glines. Workshop today called How to Make Remote Sensing Easy with Google Earth Engine and Python. And I think I speak for both of us in that we're super excited to be here and to share this with you. So first, I'm just gonna go over a little like outline of what the next two sessions are gonna look like. So today, which is about 2 hours, we're gonna do this PowerPoint, which should take about 45 minutes. Maybe we'll have like a quick 5-minute break after that. And then Max will show you the Google Earth Engine code editor and do his tutorial. And then at the very end, I will show everyone where the Python setup instructions are and kind of where to look for things. Then next on Friday, same time, it's more of a Python-oriented tutorial. So I'll show you the codes that I've dropped in the Google Drive, kind of like open-ended after that for like troubleshooting or helping people do things, or understanding the code, or you know, if there's time to show like different functions or calculations that people are interested in. And also, I think this is a good time for me to drop the link for, oh, Max already dropped it. Amazing. Thank you. Thank you, Max. Outline for this PowerPoint, where we're going to go over, we're going to give you a very, very brief introduction to remote sensing. We're going to talk about the steps to setting up your coding environment, getting shape files, the process of downloading or accessing satellite data, visualizing the data, and exporting the data. And what we're going to do during this is show you how to do all of these things either in Google Earth Engine or in Python. So a quick introduction to the Landsat satellite series. So this is the satellites that both of us will be using in our tutorial. There have been many Landsat satellites, and they all have the same resolution and they all go around the Earth kind of at the same speed. So what this means is that the satellite flies over, and then the data you get out are in 30 meter by 30 meter pixels, and it goes around the Earth every 16 days. So if you want a long like time series of satellite data, you're like, ideally, if you didn't care about cloud conditions, you would get an image every 16 days. You can see that there's a pretty long record. So given that the kind of satellite era only started in 1979, we have Landsat 5 from 1984 to 2011, all the way up. And one of the like pros of using something like Landsat, such kind of a long data record. The USGS publishes this data, and they make different products out of the raw satellite data, and we'll get more into that. But if it's a level 2 product, that means they have like kind of already harmonized the data over the satellites, because as the satellites have gotten more advanced, like the measurements are better. And so, you know, Landsat 5, like the same as something like Landsat 8 or Landsat 9. And this is just a little overview. You know, satellite flies over. And then once you do this tutorial, you can use that satellite data and make a nice, pretty graph like this. And now I will hand it over to Max.
Yeah, thank you, Carolien. So we're not going to go super in depth on sort of the physics and everything of remote sensing, but it's important to get into all of the different reflectance that will be measured by the sensor. So the way the satellite works is it's measuring reflected light from the Earth's surface. And so when it's doing that, as the light's reflected off the surface, it obviously has to pass through the atmosphere. And as light is passed through the atmosphere, it's absorbed and it's scattered. And so the existence of the atmosphere creates an error in this measurement where you're not necessarily measuring the surface itself, but some combination of light from the surface and the atmosphere. And so when we do this, we have to remove the effects of the atmosphere. And this is done in a process called correction. Complicated, but luckily there are products that exist that have already sort of handled this interference. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. In addition to the atmosphere, you might see that there's some sun glint off the surface of your lake. And if it's a shallow lake, you could even be picking up reflectance from the bottom of the lake and submerged vegetation. Ideally, though, you'll only be picking up reflectance after you've gone through this atmospheric correction process. You'll be picking up reflectance from the water itself and from anything in the water, such as chlorophyll, dissolved organic matter, or suspended particulate matter. And so using the reflectances from that, so if you see that your reflectances are particularly high in the green band, maybe you have a lot of chlorophyll. It's particularly high in the red, maybe you have a lot of suspended matter. But you can use these various reflectances in these bands and convert it into a more usable water quality measurement. So next slide, please. So in addition to the Landsat data set, which is what we're going to be using, there are that you can use. So even after this workshop, if you don't want to do the Landsat stuff that we've shown you, there's a ton of different data sets, and all of what we show you today will be applicable to those as well. So there's other satellite data sets. There's Sentinel, MODIS. There's a bunch of satellites. I don't know how familiar everyone is with these names, but there's all kinds of fun stuff in there. In addition to that, there's elevation data, there's land cover data, climate data, and really a ton of different options. And so there's some very specific for specific countries. There's global products. There's even very small scale regional products that have been uploaded in here. And you can search all of that at the link on this slide right here. In addition, there in a few years will hopefully be an inland water product. They're working on this product, which has been calibrated for aquatic reflectance from inland water bodies. Right now, they're still working on it. Hopefully, in a few years, they'll figure that all out, get it perfect. And slide, please. So getting into some limitations of using Landsat. So going back to the atmospheric correction that I was discussing earlier, like I said, you have to do atmospheric correction to remove the atmospheric effects, or else any change in the atmosphere is going to affect your measurements, and you could incorrectly interpret that as a change in the water itself. And it's important to note that the data that we will be using in this workshop are not specifically corrected using an atmospheric correction algorithm that's designed for water. It's an algorithm that's designed for surface implementation. And so using it on water results in potentially some significant errors. And there have been several studies that have looked into this. At the end of the PowerPoint, there's a slide with links. There's a link to a paper that really looks into this. But in terms of comparing raw reflectance from the satellite to actual measured reflectance at the site itself, there can be a decent amount of error. And so when you're using this data and make sure that it's working correctly for your lake, because it varies a lot site to site. And we'll get into some validation stuff later. There are a lot of water-specific algorithms, but they're not incredibly easy to implement in Google Earth Engine. it takes a lot of work, and you usually have to use a site-specific calibration. But there are options for doing this that we won't necessarily be getting into in this workshop. And it's also worth noting that these differences, the differences between, are most noticeable in clear water. So if you're studying a very eutrophic lake, this might not be an issue at all. But if you're studying something in an isoligotrophic lake, this could potentially cause an issue, and you'll have to evaluate if this is appropriate for your site. Next slide. And so when you look at the data sets in Google Earth Engine, there are a bunch of different options for Landsat. And so on the left here, it's called Collection 2, Level 2, Tier 1. And so it kind of gets confusing when you're looking through them, but that's the one that's atmospherically corrected. There's also a top of atmosphere product. You don't want to use that because that has not removed the effect of the atmosphere. That's measuring, as it implies, the top of the atmosphere. So unless you want the atmosphere in there, which you almost never would for our purposes, you don't want to use that data set. And then there's raw images, which have absolutely no correction at all. It's just the raw images, again, as the name implies. So make sure when you're doing this on your own, you use the surface reflectance product. And so after that, we will be moving on to actually implementing this in Google Earth Engine.
All right, so here we're going to lay out a few of the pros and cons of both approaches, so you can choose which one is best for you. So starting with Google Earth Engine, the big pro is that you don't need to download any software. It's like very easy to just kind of like hit the ground running in terms of doing your analysis. They have a lot of easy visualization tools, so it's very easy to just like within a few minutes get a plot of some satellite data. You can also make your own shapefiles in a bunch of ways, which Max's built-in functions that can be very convenient. Some of the cons of Google Earth Engine include the fact that there's no iteration. So if you code at all, you have probably encountered a for loop. There is not a way to do traditional for loops in Google Earth Engine. So that means if you have more than one site that you're trying to do, this might be a little complicated. There are limited operations is that you can't really customize it. The coding language is specific to Google Earth Engine, so it builds off of JavaScript, but then there's also like an internal Google Earth Engine language. And for that reason, it's kind of a very single purpose coding language to learn. And then I am biased towards Python, as you found out, as well, you will find out exactly how much I'm biased. And a lot of the reasons is in Python, the way I'm used to coding previously, meaning I can do for loops and I can basically customize anything I want. I find the language of Python pretty straightforward. Like any coding language, there's going to be a learning curve, but generally I find it pretty straightforward. You can use Python for a ton of other things besides remote sensing. For me, specifically about remote sensing, you can like query specific pixels and you have more access to like manipulating the matrix of pixels, as opposed to Google Earth Engine kind of condenses things. The cons is that it's kind of annoying to set up your Python environment. And if you do choose the Python route today and on Friday, you will see how it can be frustrating and slow to download. But I also have really nicely laid out instructions for you to hopefully it can be. And also getting the actual satellite data, you're like actually downloading it as opposed to like querying it from the Google Earth Engine supercomputers. So it is slower in that sense. But then you have it, it's downloaded. All right, so I'm going to briefly go over the Python setup. But in the Google Drive, there is a Word document called Python GEE instruction. This. So if you want to do the Python route, as in if you want to come to the workshop on Friday, you're going to want to do this. I would, like, if you have a slow computer, old computer, or you're going to be using your computer for a lot of other things today, I would say do this like during the night and then leave it overnight so you don't have to like watch it load. There is a really great course that I'm going to reference a lot called earthdatascience.org. They have a ton, almost like everything related to what we're going to be doing in this workshop, plus a lot of other things. And this is how I originally set up my Python environment to do all this kind of work. So if you've never like worked in like a terminal or anything, like it might seem a little scary at first, but they do a really good job at like outlining every step and making it very accessible. So there is a lot of legwork here. But basically once you set up your Python environment, you like don't have to think about it unless you like break something somehow. But then, so this will take you a while, and while it's downloading, if you haven't already, please make your Google Earth Engine account, which you will need for both options. Then after you have set up your Earth Analytics Python toolbox, which is what that tutorial will show you to do, you want to add 2 more packages. And these will kind of connect your Python environment to the Google Earth Engine servers in a way. So you have the Google Earth Engine, have the third toolbox called GEE map, which was developed by a researcher to basically like increase the capabilities of the Google Earth Engine API within the Python environment. So both of these, you know, the combination will set you up to do all the codes that I'll show on Friday. And yeah, the detailed instructions are in the drive.
Yeah. The API, the online API code editor, all you have to do is make an account, and then you're good to go. Pretty easy. And the link to how you can make an account was shared in the email that sent the link for this same Zoom meeting. So if you haven't done that, it's a really quick process. You just make the account, and then you can do whatever you want with the code editor.
Yes, so you can see the pros and cons in action here.
Moving on from how to set everything up to what we're going to actually do, you know, once we're in the code editor and in Python. And so generally, when you're working with lakes, the first thing you want is a shapefile denoting your lake or the watershed of your lake or several different lakes, whatever study area you want a shapefile to interact with. In many cases, it's pretty easy to find a shapefile online. A lot of the times you can just Google, like if you want a Big Moose Lake, you can search Big Moose Lake shapefile that way. Certain areas like the US, the NHD dataset has a shapefile for just about every lake in the country. So that's very convenient. But if you're unable to find a shapefile, you can actually make your own shapefile, and I'll show you how to do that. It's a pretty straightforward process, but you can do it for whatever lake you want, and then you can have that shapefile for all your future work. And so once you have your shapefile, if to use it in the online API, you're going to have to upload. And then to where in Python, you can just have it locally on your computer, and you can load it in as you do with coding. And so getting into a little bit of how this works, and you'll see this in a lot more detail soon. When you're working in the API, like I said, you upload your shapefile as an asset. And then it's a pretty straightforward process from there. You import the desired data set in this set shapefile into your script, and I'll show you how to do that. Once it's in there, you can very easily filter images to only the ones that intersect your shapefile. From there, you can specify the time period, the cloud cover percent that is acceptable, all kinds of other filters too. You can filter for time of year, whatever time period interannually you might want, all kinds of stuff. And then once you do that, you can mask the cloud, and you can clip images to your shapefile and then export them in various formats.
And then the same process in Python via the Google Earth Engine API is that you turn your locally stored shapefile into a Google Earth Engine object via that extra Google Earth Engine toolbox that I was talking about earlier. Then it's pretty similar to Google Earth Engine in the way that you specify your and then you run your data downloader. So instead of having kind of instantaneous server access in the way that Google Earth Engine code editor has, this will allow you to download the data, but it really depends on how many images you want and the size of your images. So like the code that I'll give you for this workshop will take probably about like 2-3 minutes to run, and then you'll have the data downloaded. But also I have downloaded, for example, every band for a really big lake for like 20 years of satellite data, and that took like 18 hours. So the time does vary for the actual download. And then optional, you could, once you have that data kind of downloaded in your Python environment, you can save it locally and mask clouds and do other things to it. So this is the picture at the bottom is just showing you for Big Moose Lake, how much, there can be clouds and shadow data because it doesn't reflect the actual surface of the lake.
Right, so once you've processed all of your data, you generally want to export it out of Google Earth Engine, and you can work with it in whatever other programming language you want. So for most of us, probably R. We all really like R. And so the best way to load data into R usually is with a CSV. You can get CSV of summary statistics, so you can take the mean of your lake, the median, any of that type of stuff. If you want something other than just a CSV, you can export an image, which you can load into GIS, R, whatever. You can export a fun little time series video, but they're always nice for presentations. You can see how the lake has changed over time. You can export a shapefile. So if you don't have a shapefile for your lake and you go through the process to create one, like I'll show you, you can export it and send it to other people. I don't really ever do other stuff. These are the ones that I use, but there's all kinds of different things you can export from here. It's very exciting.
I agree. It is very exciting. And those time series videos are a very cool perk of Google Earth Engine. So in Python, we have to calculate these summary statistics ourselves. So you'll get a 3D array, and then you can calculate your summary statistics if that's what you want. If you've done anything with Python, maybe you're aware of pandas, which is, basically like CSV kind of like format. And you might want to take your 3D array and turn it into a nice 2D data set. And then there is one line to export the pandas data frame, or really a lot of other things to CSV files, and save it locally and share it that way. And so I regularly send CSV files to a collaborator of mine who works in R, so it works. All right, moving on once again. I'm going to show you an example, a few examples of the type of statistics and calculations you can do in Python, and like kind of the ways that you might want to think about a 3D matrix. So for example, we have Avalanche Lake at 3 different times. It's probably during the winter because it's below freezing, and also a bunch of clouds have, we've had to remove a bunch of pixels. So there's a few things, like obviously everyone knows what an average is, but just some terminology. A spatial average is when you're taking the average over space. So if you did the spatial average of your data set over time, that means you're going to have 3 points at the end. And this is going to be the average of this time.
Hello.
When I think of a temporal average per pixel, that means in the end you're going to get as many numbers as there are pixels. So per pixel would mean taking so this value, and this value, averaging all of those, and then doing that for every pixel perhaps. And I to like think about the directions that you're doing everything in. Some scaled up examples. So this one here is the temporal average. So you can see common nomenclature. JJA is June, July, August from 2014 to 2022. So you can think of this as like the past few summers of temperature, and this is the temporal average of a lake. And this one is pretty cool because you can see like, oh, it's a lot colder here on one side of the lake and it's much warmer on this other side, and the tributary that leads to it is also warmer. Then if you want an old-fashioned time series, this is a spatial average. So every point here is the spatial average for a particular date. And yeah, and then you can get the time series. And as you can see, it's like, what's happening here? But yeah. A few examples of different types of data analysis. Perhaps you don't care about one lake, you want to look at a lot of lakes. Last year I was doing a project and I had 30 something lakes. Oops. So this is a box plot of what I call warm season, so May 1st to October 31st, and you can see, and these are the spatial averages, but then the distribution of the spatial averages, so you can kind of see where the average temperature of all the lakes over time, or like over. Also good to note, especially when you're thinking about validating and calibrating, is like how different the temperatures may appear in different parts of the lake. So this is essentially the maximum versus the min, so the range of temperatures within the lake for one measurement. And you can see a lot of them have quite a big difference in that different parts of the lake are measured differently by the satellite. That seasons do play a role in the availability. So in the Northern Hemisphere, generally during the winter, it's a lot cloudier because, because of the weather. And that means your data availability is going to change over the course of the year. So especially when you're doing stuff like, and I think generally, especially with lakes, seasonality is an important component of things. But, if you want to compare, let's say winter to summer, whatever, you want to be aware that your sample sizes for the warmer months may be drastically different than the cold months. It's just something to be aware of. And finally, just a note on point measurements. I know that some people just have lat-long points and they're like, okay, I don't want to look at a lake. I just want to look at a specific point. That's totally fine, but a word of caution, you never want to take the data of just one pixel because that will a lot. The general advice is to take a 3x3 grid of the pixels surrounding your area and average that to get a better answer. And that also means that you have to think about what you're trying to measure versus what the biggest, like what the smallest area you can feasibly measure with a satellite. So for example, Landsat data has a 30-meter grid, which means that if you want a point measurement, what you're really meter square. So, you know, if you want to measure the temperature of a puddle on a sidewalk, you're not going to be able to do that with Landsat or really with any data set. So that's just like an important consideration to think about, like the scale of your measurement. And I can show you some code for finding the nearest pixel by request, and we can talk more about that if there's like people in the workshop who are particularly interested in that. I can give the overall package. I just want to mention that. All right, and on to Max.
Carolien, there was a question someone asked, why take a 3x3 square and not something like 5x5? What's the significance of 3x3?
That's a great question.
Or rather, if I may precise, I was wondering whether you had done, whether you were aware of any validation of that, of anyone testing that.
I'm not aware across the top of my head, but I do know that the reason for that with Landsat temperature, surface temperature in particular, is because the thermal sensor, the resolution of the thermal sensor is 100 meters, and then they use other bands that have a resolution of 30 meters to downscale that that measurement into the surface temperature. They're already taking, like, one of the things that goes into the surface temperature calculation is already just this big, and they're using other data to kind of extrapolate what the surface temperature could be. But generally it's better just to take the 3x3 grid.
Yeah, I would be interested in any reference regarding that if you have.
I can totally look into it. That's a really good point. I've always just been told that by like different remote sensing scientists, like always do a 3x3 grid because of the error. But
Okay,
great
thank you very much.
Okay, and Kathy says, to some people's knowledge, there is not a published paper playing with buffer sizes. So perhaps an interesting project for one of. All
right. Okay, so Carolien just showed everyone a bunch of very cool plots that she came up with. But how do you know that those plots are actually accurate? You have to always validate the data, especially as we mentioned, the potential errors using the surface reflectance product from Landsat. And so there are different ways to validate. So here, Carolien is showing the satellite trend versus the field trend for these various satellites and times of year. And so you can see that generally it's pretty good, but there are some differences, and it's up to you to determine, if those differences are acceptable. What amount of error is acceptable for what you're doing. But you have to always check to make sure that it's working correctly. It's also important to consider the overlap between the satellite image and the in situ measurement. So in this case, Carolien says she used a 7-day window on each side of the field measurement. So if an image passed over the lake within 7 days of a field measurement, she treated those as an overlap. And so that value, the 7-day window, that window changes a lot depending on the parameter, depending on the system. So you can play around with that and see what works well, but it's important to try to get the matchup as close as you can without limiting the data too much. And so here's just an example, another validation example. And so this is something that I was working on. In this case, I extracted reflectance data from lakes, and I fed that into a random forest model with matchups and in situ data to predict these various water quality parameters. And so looking at our plots here, so the black points on there are means, and the colored hexagons represent points. And so you see, looking at those bins of individual points, there's a lot of variation in there, especially towards the higher ends of measured values. But looking at the mean value, it works pretty well. So if you wanted to look at just a long-term mean, in this case, I used a 3-day window for this. I got that from some literature. I forget the exact source, but they were looking at water quality and they used a 3-day window. Right, and so then if you want, so the goal of this was to look at trends over time. So looking at these figures on the right here, the purple line is the satellite estimate and the green is the measured. And so comparing how they vary across time, it's okay. It's not amazing. It's not horrible. And so, but generally there's not really a huge bias that you see. You don't see that the satellite varies wildly from the in situ data. And so in this case, I think it's okay if you're looking for trends. In most cases, it gets the trend pretty right. But again, it's up to you. It depends on what you're looking at. It depends on your lake, the systems you're studying, to determine what is an acceptable amount of error. And it's important to always do this validation. Otherwise, with the surface reflectance product, it could just be noise from the atmospheric correction method. The next slide. Right, and so some implications of these errors. Point measurements generally have a pretty high chance. Data I showed on that last slide. If I wanted to take a point, if I wanted to know the Secchi depth of a lake on September 13th, 2023, I'd probably be off by a couple meters. But if I'm looking at the average annual Secchi depth, it's pretty close. And so in a lot of cases, using trends with this type of data is the most useful way to go. But even with those trends, there can be some differences, but if you don't harmonize the data, differences between satellites create biases. So it's very important, as we said, to validate that data, check to make sure there isn't a bias over time. And you can always freshen up on your remote sensing fundamentals using the links provided at the end of this PowerPoint from Carmen and Igor's workshop they did at the Poland meeting. And there's a paper in there that discusses in more detail the potential biases associated with the surface reflectance product.
All right, and I just want to mention that there are alternatives to Google Earth Engine. All the data that Google Earth Engine provides on its big supercomputer servers is open source and available elsewhere. Like Google did not, send the satellites out. In the case of US satellite data and other data sets produced by the United States government are available generally at earthexplorer.usgs.com. This website is, however, not as easy to use as it is to query data with Google Earth Engine. But I just want to mention it because this may be useful for some of you depending on your project. These images come in .tiff or netcdf formats, which maybe some of you are familiar with already. And if you do go to the Python route, there are already packages and a lot of community documentation for working with data in these two formats. But there, like in the course material that I give you, there's other related course material available on that website that will help you work with this stuff. But in like, as you figure out whether you're going to go do Google Earth Engine code editor, my version of, Python Google Earth Engine API, or the more traditional route with Earth Explorer, you really want to think about just like what makes sense for your project, and also like which long-term, especially if you're a student, what else are you going to do after this project, and how can you prepare yourself for that. So with that, we give you this motivational message in your own troubleshooting and efforts to try this, and then we're also going to leave you with the links. So these two first one, this one here is really nice. There's in Igor with a lot of the same material they gave at the Poland workshop. This is also really great if you're interested in the European satellites like Sentinel. I think the data analysis and stuff is a bit more centered on that, so that can be really useful. But also, if you're new to remote sensing, I think this is great just to get some of the more in-depth fundamentals. Like Max said, we have a great Landsat article about implications for using different Landsat series. And then here is the link to the data to the website that has an entire semester courses worth of Python tutorials. So earthdatascience.org is a website created by CU Boulder lecturers for their Python stuff. And there's a lot of other workshops and tutorials there. So I really recommend that you check it out if the Python route is the way you're going to go. All right, so my screen share here. You should all have that PowerPoint via the drive, and I think we should take a 5-minute break. Max, are you good with that before starting your workshop?
Yeah, that would be okay. And during the break, if anyone has questions as well, we'll be around.
Okay, great. Awesome. Yeah, so it's 10 at 10:55, and then Max will give his tutorial on Google Earth Engine. So also, if you haven't made your Google Earth Engine account, maybe now is a good time to start that.
Yeah, that would be a good time. You don't need it if you don't need to have it done. It's not super important that you follow along with the script as I'm going, but if you want to, you do need a Google Earth Engine account. And there's also materials in the link. I'll share the link again. Files that we use, you can download those, and the scripts I use are in there as well. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the Google Earth Engine code editor demonstration. Hopefully everyone has returned from our brief break. And so I'm just going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. This thing's in my way. There we go. Okay, can you see my screen, Carolien? Cool. All right, so just an introduction to the code editor. When you open it up, it's going to look like this. So if you've just created your account and you're opening it for the first time, it's going to look exactly like this, except you won't have scripts over here. And so with the general layouts, you have these 3 different boxes up top. You have a search bar, and you have this big map down here. So first, we'll look at the box on the left. There's 3 tabs: scripts, docs, and assets. So the scripts tab, that's where we store scripts. Little scripts here, you can save them. You can make folders. So here I have a folder for this workshop. I have other folders for some stuff. And so you can make scripts, you can save them here and reference them later. I'm going to go ahead and open up a script. I'll open up the Big Moose NDVI script, which is in the Google Drive folder we shared. So if you want to follow along, open up that one. So that's the scripts. You can open up and save all your scripts here, and you can manage them just like you would with any other. And then the middle tab, docs. This is a very useful tab. This has a bunch of different codes that Google Earth Engine has created to do a lot of remote sensing specific stuff. So for example, if we click on classifier, here's a ton of different algorithms for supervised classification methods. So here's a random forest one. You click on it, and it tells you what the function does. It tells you what all the different inputs are. And so if you have how to do something, there's a very good chance that it's in here. So if you're looking for different ways to filter the data, you can search filter and scroll down to the ee.filter. There's a ton of different filtering options. And so you'll notice that a lot of things here are ee.something. So the ee specifies that it's happening entirely on Google's server. So that's one of the big advantages of using this online API. Pretty much everything is done on Google's server. You don't have to download any data. And so you can run it even if you have a computer that's not particularly powerful. So that's the docs tab, very useful. And then the last tab in that left box is the assets tab. And so this is where you would upload your shapefiles, for instance. If you have something outside of Google Earth Engine and you want to work with it in Google Earth Engine, you can upload it here. And so you see I have a bunch of different assets. I think pretty much all of them are shapefiles, but you can also upload images as well. So if there's a certain image that isn't, upload it here. So to upload an asset, you simply click on the new button here, and it gives you the option of what you want to upload. So I'll show you how to upload a shapefile since we're going to be doing that. Right, so just click on the shapefile. It'll ask you to select source files. So we click on this. I'm going to go ahead and upload one of the shapefiles I'll be using for this. So the Big Moose watershed shapefile. To do it, you have to select all of the associated file types with it. Shapefiles have many different files. It's kind of the same thing. So you select all of those, and then you hit open. All of them show up here. Sometimes, depending on how the shapefile was made, you will have more than these 5 things, more than these 5 file extensions, and Google Earth Engine will get upset at you and say it won't accept some of them. And so you can simply just delete the ones it doesn't accept. In this case, it selects everything. You can name the asset whatever you want. I'm going to name it and then once you do that, there's all this stuff down here. We're going to ignore that. Just hit the upload button. Over here, the tasks tab, that's orange, and we can see the progress of our asset uploading. So it only takes a short amount of time, and soon that will be available. So that's the leftmost tab. In the middle of the box, you have your actual code editor. And so since I've loaded a script, It's not empty anymore. And so here you write all the code that you want to work with. And you'll notice that I have this little, if you've just opened Google Earth Engine yourself, you won't have an import box until you import something. So when you're doing that, you see I've imported Landsat 8, I've imported several assets as shapefiles. So if you want to import a data set such as Landsat 8, you can search in the bar up here. There's a million different Landsats in here, or Landsat data sets. So just search Landsat 8. You can see there's a ton. There's a ton of Landsat collections, so it's important to get the right one. In our case, we want the Landsat 8 collection to level 2, tier 1. And you see it says this contains atmospherically corrected surface reflectance. So you can click on that, and it gives us a ton of information on it, which is really nice. It has all this. It has a nice description. It has some notes. You can look at the bands. So we see the names of the bands. All the satellites are usually going to have different names. So it's important to look at this and get familiar with the syntax of each satellite. And it has a description of each band. It has the values. It has the size, the resolution of 30 meters. Also of importance, so we have all our surface reflectance bands. So blue up through shortwave infrared. Here's the temperature band. Here's some other bands. One of the most important ones is this QA pixel band. The QA pixel band indicates whether or not a pixel is high quality, and it can identify when a pixel has been determined to be cloudy. And so that's very important for us. They've sort of already done this for us, and so we can use this band as. So those are all the bands. There's also image properties. And so every single image in the collection has associated properties. And there's a ton of these. You see there's a cloud cover property. That's an important one. That tells you the percentage of the entire image that's covered in clouds from 0 to 100. There's all kinds of stuff in here. There's, of course, time and date. There's Earth's, there's a lot of stuff in here. In this case, though, for the most part, we're going to just be looking at the filter your image collection by any of these properties if you want. So if you want a certain path or row, that would be sort of that sort of indicates the coordinates of the image. You can filter that way. If you want a certain processing level, go ahead and filter by that. You can filter by any of these, is the point. So those are the properties. And then, sorry, the zoom controls are kind of in my way. So once you have found the data set that you want, you just click on the import button and then close out of that, and you see it'll pop up in your imports box. And when you import a new data collection, it's going to show up as image collection. You can rename it whatever you want. I'm going to name it and so there it is. And once it's up there, you can click on it and you can get that same thing up. And so now it's been designated as a variable in our script, and we can work with it in the code editor. Right, and so the final, I see a hand raised. Is there a question?
Yes, sorry. I think that I have a, but how I upload the code to the Google Earth Engine?
Oh, sorry. Yes, that's a good question. So the code I put in the drive, the code I put in the drive is a text file. What you're going to want to do is just copy and paste the entire text file into the code editor, and then you can save it as a script in your own Google Earth Engine account.
Okay, perfect. It is script 1 and the.
Yes, that's the one I'm working with right now.
Okay.
Yeah, so that is the code editor tab, the biggest one we have there. And then there's this tab on the right, and there's 3 tabs in that one. There's the inspector. You can click on them. Once we have layers, you can click on them, and it'll give you the values of all the layers at that point. And so that's really helpful to determine if your code is actually doing what you want it to do. There's the console. You can print results to the console, and it will display them for you. So you'll see that later. And then the tasks, which we've already looked at, this shows us tasks. And once it's blue, that means it's done. If it's red, it's failed. So you can see that the shapefile I uploaded as an asset is finished. So if we go over to the Assets tab again, and refresh it and look for the shapefile, it isn't there. Cool. Where'd it go? Okay, well, it's not there. Normally it's going to show up there. Hopefully for all of you, your shapefiles will show up correctly. I've never had it not show up before until right now. So that's convenient. Okay, so that, oh, and then we have the map down here. In the map, you can scroll around and you'll be able to display your images down here as you're working. And you can create various geometries. You can put a point somewhere and then you can interact with that point. You can make a nice little polygon. Right, so there's a great polygon. And you can choose whether or not you want to display the layers using this. And then once we start displaying images, I'll show you how to filter through them. So let's get into the actual code. So what we're going to be doing here is creating an NDVI time series for a lake watershed. So that's something that I think people might find very helpful. You can see what's going on in your watershed. Maybe you have an invasion of some sort of species that defoliates trees and you want to see how it's affecting the watershed. NDVI time series, and we'll export it as a CSV file. And we'll export all of the bands, the median of all the bands, and you'll get a CSV that has all that information that you can work with in R. If you wanted to export all of the reflectance values for the lake itself, I have code at the end to do that. It's essentially the exact same process. There's just one very, very tiny change. Right, so I'm going to go ahead and run my script. When you run the script, you can't do line by line, the whole thing runs. I'm going to that will explain. So you can see an image has appeared in upstate New York. So that's going to be the area we're working in the Adirondacks. So I'll zoom in on it. And you see in the console, a bunch of stuff has also appeared. And so we'll get into what that is. So the first thing that I did was display the lake and watershed shape files that I've imported into my script. And you do that using this map.addLayer command. This is how you display anything to the map. So you display the name of what you want to display. Properties, there will be properties later for the images, and then the name of the layer. And so now you can see that stuff is shown up here. You can manage your layers in this layer tab. So I'll turn off everything except the shape files. So the shape file has uploaded for our lake. There it is. And there is the shape file for the watershed. And so now we can interact with each of these. So the next thing we do, we read in the imagery. So when you read in the imagery, this Landsat 8 collection across the entire globe that Landsat 8 has ever collected. So it's a lot of images. It's way too many to work with. So the very first thing we do is we use this .filter bounds command that selects only the images that overlap with our watershed. So now we've greatly reduced the size of this data set. And so this is one of those custom, if you need to know how exactly to filter by whatever property you want, you can search in here, filter, and that filter bounds function came this docs tab. So after we do that, we can string another filter into it. And here we do a generic filter. And then we add within that, we do the ee.filter. It's kind of a strange JavaScript coding thing. This is just the syntax for it. So you do a filter. Within the filter, we say, create a filter for less than or equal than cloud cover of 1. As cloud cover of more than 1%. So we only want to see non-cloudy images. And then I print the result of that filtering, and I call it unfiltered image collection. And we can look at it, and we can see that there are 32 images in our collection. And we can look at each of them and all of their properties individually if we'd like. So whenever you use this print command, that will put the result in the console. Otherwise, you won't be able to see your variables unless you use that print command. So the next thing we want to do is view our image. And before we do that, we need to know the properties of how to display that image. So when you display an image, you have to display. Sorry, this is a little bit complicated and weird, but it's a Google Earth Engine thing. You have to display the min and the max values. If you do that incorrectly, it's just going to be all black or all white, and it's going to look bad. So you have to figure out what the appropriate min and max are for your data. To do that, we use console. That's what this section of code is doing. Again, I got this function directly from the docs tab on the left. So we select the first image from our collection, just randomly, assuming all of them will have similar values. We select the red, blue, or the red, green, and blue, so bands 4, 3, and 2. We want to display those because those are what go into the true color images that we can see. So we do that. We clip it to the watershed in the shapefile we uploaded, and we set the scale to 1000. You can set the scale to whatever. The lower the scale, the longer it'll take. And in this case, it doesn't need to be incredibly accurate. We just want base values, so the scale is 1000. We print the histogram, and here it is. And we can see the minimum value is 7,300. The maximum value is a little under 10,000. So that's how I got these display parameters when displaying the image. So I just do another map. When you're adding an image, you have to determine you have to tell which bands to show, and these min, max, and the gamma value. The gamma just lightens or darkens the image. You just play around with that until it looks good. And we'll call this layer unclipped image. So we display our unclipped image, and there's the whole image. So it's a very large image. Of course, most of what we're interested is right here, and a lot of this image is very unnecessary for us. So the next thing we want to do is essentially just interest. To do that, I've created this function called mask inside. So in Google Earth Engine, like with other coding languages, you can create functions, and this is the format for doing so. And this syntax, or this function, simply masks anything inside of a shapefile. So it'll remove anything that's inside. And so here we remove anything that's in the lake shapefile. So we want to look at just the watershed without the influence of this lake. So that's what this lake does here. If you were to change this, if you were to change the name of your shapefile, the function that's the only part of the function you would have to change, the lake. Right. So what we're going to do is just refilter the data to something a bit more reasonable. So that it's the exact same function as before, exactly the same as up here. But now we've changed it to remove anything with more than 10% cloud. So we're being a little bit more lenient with our cloud cover. Here, this .map function that we're applying here, this is essentially the closest you can get to a for loop in Google Earth Engine. The map function will apply whatever function you put inside of it to every single image in the collection. And so this is going through each image and individually clipping each of them to, right? And so if you wanted to clip it to something else, you would simply change this variable within the function there. And then I map that mask inside function so that the lake pixels are completely filtered out. And so now we can just, I print that to our console. We can see that now we have 109 images. And to make sure that they've actually displayed as we want them to, they're clipped to the watershed, I will simply clipped image this time. So we can turn on the clipped image parameter or layer, and there it is. You can see that our image now is only within the watershed. And you can see there are some clouds in there. So the next step is creating a function to mask out the clouds. This relies on that QA pixel band I mentioned earlier. This function, it uses bitwise stuff. I don't know if anyone's familiar with bits, but they're very confusing, and I don't know what they are, to be honest. Fortunately, Google Earth Engine has made this function publicly available. There's a lot of stuff that they make a lot of tutorials themselves, and if you're ever having an issue, like to find this function, I said, how do I mask clouds in Landsat Collection 2, Level 2, Tier 1? And it takes you right to a Google Earth Engine page made by the creators of Google Earth Engine, and they gave me this function. So that's another great thing about it, is there's a lot of resources available. So this function, it's clouds and cloud shadows, right? So we create the function. The next thing we do is apply the function. And so simply we use our map function again to map our masking clouds over the data set. So then we'll display that and we'll call it cloud mask. We show cloud mask now. And if we remove the other layers, you can see that it has removed everywhere that there's a cloud. And it's not going to be perfect or remnants of clouds, and sometimes it might remove more cloud than is actually there. But overall, it's pretty solid. And you're going to always need to do this before working with data to ensure the clouds aren't messing things up. So once you do that, we will create a function to add the NDVI. So the NDVI is normalized differential vegetation index. It's something very similar to that, normalized difference vegetation index maybe. But this essentially is an indicator of area and how healthy that vegetation is. So a value of -1 is no vegetation. It would be like water should be close to -1, and healthy growing vegetation should be 1. So we want to see that for a watershed. We want to see what's going on in the watershed and how it's changing over time. So to do that, we create a function using the same format as before. And we see there's a normalized difference function that, again, I got straight from the docs tab. Here it is. So it tells you exactly how to use it. And so in NDVI, the formula for it is near infrared minus red divided by near infrared plus red. So that's what this function is doing. We rename that band that we've just created, NDVI, and then we return the image that was put into the function with this new NDVI band. And so that'll do that for whatever image we input. And so we just map that function across everything again, just like we've done before, and we can display that now as NDVI. And you see I've changed the min and max to -1 and 1. I've changed the band that I'm displaying to NDVI. That's important, otherwise you'll just be displaying the red, green, blue again. And I've made a color palette. And so we can look at our NDVI, and we see there's not really a ton of variation. So the darker green it is, the closer it is to 1. If it's lighter, then it should be not vegetation. And so we can see here that water bodies are showing up as lighter. So far everything's working well. We have created a nice cloud masked NDVI image for a watershed. And now we want to see, we don't want to see just one image, we want to see what's changing over time. And a nice thing about Google Earth Engine is there's a function that can display that chart right in the code editor here. Again, as always, it's taken straight from the docs. So if you ever need to create a time series, you can just search time series in there. And so we want the chart. And so we will use this UI chart image series function. And so the image collection of interest, we select NDVI. That is, of course, the image collection with that function added. And it's important to select only the NDVI band. Otherwise, it will display all of the bands on the chart on the right here, which sometimes is really nice. So if you want to display multiple bands, you can select multiple bands in here. Like for instance, that with the third band in here, you can see that 2 bands will show up in the time series. But you need to specify a region for the chart. In this case, it's our watershed. Oh, so here you see the chart now has 2 bands. Obviously, in this case, you can't really compare them because they're completely different scales. But just to show you that you can do that if you want to. For instance, if you want to compare blue and red over time, you can do it that way. So I'll just change it back to normal. So far we've specified the image collection and the bands we want. We selected the region of interest, and we need to specify the reducer. And so reducers are pretty commonly used in Google Earth Engine. Reducers essentially take an image that has many different values in it, and it reduces it to one value that you can use. There's a ton of different reducers. If you search in the Docs tab for reducers, right, there's a lot of them. Here they all are, all the EE.reducers. Reducer for like anything you could ever imagine, really. All kinds of stuff. You can do the median, you can do the standard deviation, the mean, min, max, Pearson's correlation. You can do regressions, all kinds of stuff. You can take all of these values and sort of reduce them into one value. So we're taking here the median of our entire watershed. We've set the scale to be 30 because that is the resolution of our Landsat imagery, 30 by 30 meters. If we wanted to, we could change that scale to be larger to reduce the problem. Need to. And then the X property, we simply say system time start. That's indicating that the X value should be time. And so you can see that we've made a nice little chart here, and you can interact with it, and you can see the NDVI value at each date. And you can see this nice time series with seasonal fluctuations in your NDVI. If you want to, from here, you can click on this little icon to create the chart in a separate window. And you'll see up here, you have options or a PNG. So you can download this data as a CSV. They'll just download it. And then let's check it out. It gives you a nice little CSV. It has the time and day, and it has your NDVI value. So that's a very easy way to extract a time series. If you need a larger time series, though, a longer one with more data in it, this method won't work because it won't be able to load the plot. So I'll show you how to do it. Right, so there's our time series. I displayed it in the console by using the print command. So the next thing we want to do is figure out how many pixels were masked, how many pixels were cloudy and were masked by our function. Right? We need to do this because if you just blindly mask everything and then interpret it as if all the images are the same, you might get some messed up results. It could be that the entire watershed was masked except for one pixel, and then you're interpreting that one pixel as equivalent to an image where none of the pixels are masked. And so in this way, with this function, we can add a count of all the pixels that weren't masked to get an idea of what proportion of the watershed was masked. So to do that, we're creating a function called add count. So it's just, we make a function in the same way as usual. In this case, we create a new variable called count. And you can see there's some sort of weird stuff I'm doing with this EE.number. That's just some more confusing Google Earth Engine syntax stuff. Essentially, what we want to do, ignore the EE.number for now. What we're doing is reducing the image. We use the reducer, the count reducer, so it counts every single pixel. We limit it to the watershed. We set the scale for 30. So that's going to count all of our pixels in the watershed. And a number. Google Earth Engine will not recognize that as a number. It's going to think it's an image unless you specify that it's just a number. Otherwise, it creates an image where every single value in that image is the number. So you need to use this EE.number there, and we use this .get function to extract the value for band 3. You could use any band because all of the bands will have the same number of pixels. So just input a band there. Band. And then the last thing you do, once that's done, we set that count as a property of the image, of the original unedited image. And so now we haven't changed the image at all. All we've done is add the count of the pixels as a property to the image. And once you do that, you'll be able to view that property over in the console. So that's what that function is doing. So if we run that function, we create the new count variable. And then we're just going to make another time series exactly the same as before, this time showing the count of pixels. That time series is displayed here. You can see that the maximum of our pixels is a little over 100,000. And you can see there's a lot of variation. In this case, the entire watershed was mashed out. So that image obviously is not useful for us. And there's many images in here that you see aren't very helpful. And so we'll be able to deal with that once we export the data. As it is right now, we don't need to deal with it in Google Earth Engine. We can export. And so what we're going to do is format images for export. In this case, we're taking the median NDVI of the watershed. We're actually taking the median of all the bands. And so to do that, we map this function over our whole collection, just another reducer function, just like we did before with the count and with the median NDVI. Right? We map our function, and at the end, we do return. The new image is equal to the original image with the value, the median value of each band set as a property. And then we print that collection. So let's look at an image from that collection, our collection for export. If we click on the image collection, we select an image from it, and then we look at the properties of that image. Scroll down, and you'll see here, SRB1 all the way up through SRB7. We have set the median property. When you export things as a CSV from Google Earth Engine, you're always exporting the values of the property. And so you have to set things as a property if you want that information to be exported. So that's what we've done here. And somewhere in here also is the NDVI. There it is. So we've created these new properties, and now all we have to do is export this as a table. So to do that, we use the export table to drive function. And you can find these exports in the docs section. You can see you can export images, you can export maps, you can export tables. You don't have to export them to the drive. You can export them to various other things. The drive is just generally the most convenient. So all you do is specify the collection you want to export, the file format you want, in our case CSV, and selectors. This indicates which properties we want to export. So we want to export the date, the value of all the bands, the NDVI, and the pixel count. Once you do that, you can run your script, and you'll see, and we have a submitted task. So to get it to actually export, you have to go to the Tasks tab and run the task. So we're going to run it. You can name it whatever you want. And then you can specify which folder in your drive you want. You can name the file something. We'll name it example. So this will be saved in your Google Drive as example.csv. And then we run it, and it'll take a little bit of time. Once it's done, it'll show up in your Google Drive. And this is what I exported before the workshop. So you look at the file, and you can see it's a nice CSV. Every row is an image. Every column is a value of a band. So we have all the bands, we have the NDVI, we have the pixel count. We can then filter this by pixel count. So we only have images where most of the watershed's an option. You can see here, we don't have any values for this one because it was all masked out entirely. So once you have this CSV, you can work with it however you want. And so it was a lot of code to get to this point. The process is very quick and easy. Once you have a base script to work off of, which you have here, it's pretty much the same thing for all the different instances. If you want to work on any lake, you can just upload the shapefile for that lake and modify this script accordingly. And you can get a nice CSV of NDVI. And so I know a lot of us obviously would want to have data not from the watershed, but from the lake itself, from the actual water. To do that, I've included code here. It's commented out to do that. To comment out big chunks of code, you can do a slash and a little star, and you put that before and after whatever you're commenting out, and that does a big chunk. So that code is there. That's in the script provided to you. The only difference between this and the script before is that we don't use the mask inside function. So we're not masking out the lake. And instead of clipping things to the watershed, we clip to the lake. That's the only difference. And so if you run that, you will get a time series of the surface reflectance values from the lake itself. And you can use that in whatever model you want to try to get at water quality. And so even though we didn't do that here, essentially we did. It's the exact same code, very easy. And one more thing I'll show you is a lot of the times you don't want data from the entire lake surface, then you can get interference from the edges of the lake where it might be shallower or where the shapefile intersects land. So what a lot of people do is they take a buoy. A lot of us have buoys out in our lakes, or at least points where we go to take our in situ samples, and we want to match up our data with that. To do that, we can create a buoy variable. It's a simple geometry point creation. For some reason, they do longitude and then latitude in Google Earth Engine. Kind of weird, but you just put in the coordinates of your point, and we can display that point in our map. So I'll show you that. Right, so there is our point. So imagine there's a buoy there, and you want data from there. And as Carolien mentioned in the presentation, you can't ever take data from just one pixel. You need a buffer around it. So here we'll create a buffer with a distance of 100 meters. And you can make that distance whatever you want. Just make sure it includes at least the 3x3 grid that we discussed. And so here we make our buffer, we display that. There it is. And so now if you wanted to do this exact buffer, you can. All you have to do is replace in the code above, replace the lake shapefile with the new variable we made, buoy buffer. And that would be how you would extract data for your buoy. Okay, so that is the NDVI script. I have a couple other scripts that we can go through, but if anyone has any questions on what we just did there, feel free to ask now. I know the coding, I didn't go into the details of the syntax and everything. It's very confusing. The best way to figure that out is just kind of to work with it and play around with it, find the online tutorials. But this syntax will work for this process. So Lorena, you have a question?
Yes, I have a question. Your explanation was awesome. Thank you. I think the syntax is very straightforward, but the problem is the same problem that I have in all workshops that I have done in Google Earth Engine. Is the to start. So I was not able to run the code. I was able to import the shape files, but I mean, if you have time just to pass through the beginning, I would appreciate.
Okay, yeah. So the beginning, to be able to run the script, first you copy and paste the whole script into the code editor here, and then you can run it. To run it, you just so I'll delete the ones that I was just using as example here. Delete these. So you should have your imports look like this. You should have a variable called Landsat 8, which is that level 2, collection 2, tier 1 data set. And you can name it Landsat 8 and it'll interact with the script. You can name it something else if you want to, but then you'd have to go into the script and change the variable name in there. And then you should also have the watershed and lake shapefiles named as such.
Excuse me, I didn't have these imports to code from the text file, and that did not give me those imports.
Yes, so the imports, you have to download the imports from the Google Drive folder that we shared, and then upload them as an asset So you upload the shape files as assets, like I showed here.
The shape files, yes, but the Landsat 8, the image collection?
The Landsat 8, what you do for that is you go to the search bar up top
Oh,
here,
yeah,
search for
okay.
Landsat 8,
Yeah. Yeah.
find this one, and then hit import. And then you will just have to rename it to be Landsat 8. And so if you guys are still struggling with this after the workshop ends, I'm more than happy to stick around and work with you one-on-one to get it up and running. The issue is that you have to have all the exact same names that I created in my script, otherwise it won't run. But if you do it this way, it should work as intended. A different question?
I do. Yeah, thanks, Max. This was really great. Maybe this question's a bit in the weeds, but the first time you did the CSV export of the data, it looked like there were maybe some duplicates. Is that typical, or is that kind of unexpected? Like, is there any strong reason why there would be some duplicate rows?
There can be duplicates sometimes. So in this instance, so our lake of interest, let me move, the zoom controls are in the way. So I'll just make this a little transparent. So you see how close our area is to the edge of the image? What happens is when you're close to the edge of the image, the next Landsat overpass, it should be going in a row this way, right next to it. Almost all the time, it's not a perfect line. It will overlap into the same area as this image. And so what it's doing is extracting data. There might be an image that only a little bit over intersect, and it'll get included, even though it's not a full overlap of the watershed. So I don't know if I did a good job explaining that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So then you would probably want to do some more kind of QC in R or wherever you're working with it.
Yeah, you actually can do it in Google Earth Engine itself. If you look at the image collection, the properties, every image will have associated with it a WRS path and row. Image is path 15, row 29. The next image over, maybe it's path 15, row 30. You can filter the image collection so that it has to be WRS path 15 and WRS row 29. And so to do that, I'll show you how here. You do a dot filter, just like you did with the clouds. Filter dot equal. You specify WRS path. And then we say we want, and then you do the exact same thing with the row. That's going to make sure you only get the images in this tile, and that should remove any duplicates that we see.
That's great. Thanks very much.
And there's one more question, Mamoon.
Hello, Max. Thank you. It was your nice presentation and nice coding. I really love it. Can you hear me? Yeah, Max. I have the question the surface reflectance values from the Landsat images. In here, we are just taking the band values. But as you know, as a remote sensing reflectance values is from 0 to 1. So if I would like to get the remote sensing reflectance values from 0 to 1, then should I imply the scale factor?
Yes, you can apply a scaling factor. So when you look at the image collection, max is 1 to 65,000. In this case, that is scaled by some values, and Google provides, so within the cloud masking function, this scaling, we do scale the bands here using this bit of function. They want you to multiply it by, this value, add that. So they've implemented that in the function here, and you can run that to scale it. You could make your own by just normalizing the data. It'd be the syntax for that would be the same as this section of the cloud masking code right here. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, okay. No, I have like the question, like if you see in the like Google Earth Engine, the surface reflectance band like 3, 4, 5, they have the scale after min max, okay, 2.75E05, okay, like 0.004. So if you'd like to get the reflectance values from like 0 to 1, then I can just scale these things, isn't it?
I'm not sure I'm understanding the question fully. So you want the values to be from 0 to 1?
Yes, the band value, like surface reflectance values from the B1 to B7.
Yeah. So to do that, you could do this code, select all the B bands, B1 through 7. This selects all of them with this instead of multiplying and adding, you would just divide by whatever your maximum value is. So you would say divide, it's like 65,000 or something. And then your max value will be 1, your minimum value will be whatever. It'll be from 0 to 1 in that instance.
Okay, thank you. And as like we want to get like NDVI value from the water, but as you know, like water have like really like negligible amount of NDVI value. So like chlorophyll value, like based on the NDVI, these kind of things. What do you think?
Yeah, so the water will have negative values. There's a lot of different indices. There's an NDWI, that's a water index. In that case, the water should be close to 1 and the land should be -1. There's a lot of, so you could create that, just change the values in this normalized difference function. You can get a water index. You can use that to sort of identify water versus land if you want to. Exporting NDVI for water itself isn't particularly useful, but for the watershed, it can be.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, awesome. Thanks everyone for your questions. Hopefully I answered them well. If not, I can stick around a little bit after this and work with you one-on-one. Also, feel free to email me at any point. I'm more than happy to meet with you one-on-one after this and go through stuff if this didn't run for you. Hopefully you can get it up and running. So the next thing we'll do is the second script. So if you've downloaded the scripts and you're trying to follow along, this script is called, I think it's called script 2 land cover. This one, I'm just going to show you how to extract land cover from your watershed. That's another thing that I think people want to do a lot. You don't always have that data readily available, especially if you're working on a new lake. And so you might just want to have that data for your watershed. So I'll show you how to do that. For this one, we're importing some different data. Well, I might get rid of that. So your imports, you'll have the same watershed and lake shapefile as before. We're going to be using the NLCD land cover dataset. So to get that, you can search in your bar up here, NLCD, and you can select whatever year you want. Here's one from 2021. So just as before, you can review the various bands. They'll be quite a bit different just by the nature of this data. So the bands and properties, go ahead and import that data set. So I'll delete that. So import that data set, name it land cover with no spaces or capitals. And then I have these geometry imports. Those I created myself. And when we get to that point, I'll show you how that happened. But for now, if you're following along, you should have the first 3 things in your import box. And then we can create the geometries. So the first step of extracting the land cover, exactly the same as the NDVI. We do the same function to mask out the lake because we don't want that our watershed land covering thing. So we're going to go ahead and clip that out and mask the lake just like we did before. So far, nothing new. We'll go ahead and run this so you can see our layers. In this case, there is a class palette provided for the data. So it's a property of the image collection, and we can extract it. We create a new variable called palette, and we simply extract that built-in palette that they have. And you can find the palette by looking at the properties of that data set. So once we have the palette, we can simply display our map that we've clipped for the watershed, and we can call it land cover. And so here it is. We can look at our map. We see a lot of green and a lot of blue. So a lot of open water, wetlands, and forest. Down here, we see red. So there's some urban areas as well on this end of the lake. There's not a particularly interesting watershed to study. There's not much variation, but there it is. The next thing we're going to want to do is extract the count of pixels for each of these land cover classes. That way we know the percentage of the watershed of each type of land cover. So to do that, we're going to run another reducer function, reduce region, the region being our watershed. So we specify geometry is the watershed. The reducer, we're going to use a frequency histogram reducer. And so that will return a value, just the count of every pixel that corresponds with each. So if we print that, we'll call it land cover values. We can see it gives us 14 different values. And each of these numbers is associated with the land cover class. So whatever class 11 is, we have 3,300, a little over 3,300 values, pixels of that classification. The pixels aren't whole numbers because in this case, the watershed shapefile cut some of them in half. So it's not going to be a whole number like you might expect if you're counting pixels. So that's why. But we see all of these. And if you look at the data set itself, look at the properties of it, you can see what each class represents. So here we go. 11, class 11 represents open water. Class 12, ice and snow. Class 43, mixed forest. So all that stuff is available here. So you can go back and reference that once you have extracted that data. All right, so we've extracted the data. And that's it. That's all you have to do. If you want to extract watershed data or land cover data for one watershed, you've done it. You can just copy this into a CSV, upload it into R or whatever, and work with it however you want. So you can make those calculations of the land cover in your watershed. So if you don't have that data for your watershed, it's pretty easy to get. But it's a little bit different if you're doing it for multiple shapefiles. So you might have a bunch of different lakes you want to compare their watersheds. So what you can do here, first, what I've done is I've created a list of geometries. So for this to run correctly, you're going to have to create your shapefiles because it doesn't really, it's just an example. So I just made random squares in the nearby area. So treat these as if they were shapefiles that we were interested in. So here's the third geometry. So I randomly made these 3 geometries. If you're running the script on your own, just make any 3 geometries anywhere. It doesn't matter. To do that, you can simply click on this here, create a new layer. You can make a square. Look, there's a new geometry. It's called geometry. Just keep adding new layers. And you can make it whatever shape you want. And you can just keep doing this. So that's how you get these. Just imagine that these are shapefiles. Same thing. So what you do once you have all your shapefiles, or in this case geometries, once you have them all, you create a feature list. And you do so using this format here. And I've buffered some of them just randomly, just to show you again that you can buffer stuff if you want to. You can do this, you make your list. It has to be in a list for this to work. So you have your different features, create the list. We're going to convert that list into what's called a feature collection. So now all of these features, each shapefile, they're a collection together, and they can be interacted with as a whole. Once you do that, here's our feature collection. You can see it has 3 features, and each feature has its own properties and such. So we can do that. So then what you want to do is simply take your land cover image. So we do land cover, dot first. In this case, we have to do the dot first because it's more than one image from this data set we've imported. So we want just the first one, so they're all from the same time. So we simply clip that to our new feature collection, and we can print that result. And we see we now have an image with all the same properties. And we can display that result, these next two lines. So we can look at the multi-land cover. And I'll turn off all my geometries. So you see now the land cover is displaying for my new geometries that I've created. So here they are. These are nice lake shape files. So we can display that. And then to extract the value from each shapefile, the only difference from before is that instead of using the reduce region reducer, it's reduce regions, plural. So just pop an S on there. Extract the data. We can print that data and we see the same outputs as before, right? You can look at it here. There it is. So for shapefile 1, this is our count. But you're not going to want to just manually copy all of this like we did with the first one, because you might have a lot of shapefiles. It's going to be a lot of work. So we can export it as a CSV using this very simple line, export table to drive. That just like we did before, right? The task is now running, and just like before, I've done this beforehand, so we can see what it looks like. This is what your output's going to look like. It's a very strange and confusing output, and a very inconvenient output to work with, but that's just how Google Earth Engine does it. So I'll open it up in Excel so you can see. In this case, each row is a shapefile, so your watershed. And the values of interest are in the histogram column. You can see you have 52 equals whatever, 95 equals whatever. So this is simply telling you there's 4,144 pixels in class 52. And unfortunately, this is the way it exports. There is probably a way to make it more manageable, but this is how I've figured out how to do it. So you're going to have to just put this into R and separate all of these manually and get it into a format that works. But the important thing is that you've gotten the information out of Google Earth Engine and onto your own computer to work with. The land cover extraction. One thing to note, so I used a US specific data set, the National Land Cover data set. If you're not working on lakes in the US, which I imagine many of you are not, you can search for land cover. There might be land cover for your specific area. So like here, this appears like it could be Europe or maybe just Italy. Europe. So this one's specific to Europe. So if you're working in Europe, that could be a good collection for you. If not, there is a global. Generally ones that are specific to a certain region, like this one for Iran. If you're studying in Iran, this is probably an excellent data set. And you'd much prefer it over the global one because it was specifically designed for Iran and it should be very accurate. So just in case you don't have lakes in the US you're working with, there are many global products in here that you can access. So that's the land cover extraction script. Yes, Kathy, question.
You to hover on this screen so that we can screen cap what you're calling stuff, because I don't think that's written down somewhere.
You're right. I'll delete the ones that are extra. And what I'll do is I'll edit the script so it has this information. So
cool.
You can download it after.
Thank you.
So any other questions on this? I know getting the imports named correctly is sometimes a struggle in the middle of these workshops, but us out and I'll put them in the Google Drive so you all can access that and run it on your own. Okay, so I just have one more script. This one is creating a shape file. So here we have 3 imports. One is our lake shapefile, because we're gonna just want to compare the one we create to the already existing one. I'm just gonna run this so I can find where the lake is. Okay, here it is. Okay, so we're going to be creating a shapefile for Big Moose Lake. You will do this if you don't have your own shapefile and you think you would want to use one frequently. It's very convenient to be able to do this. So import the lake shapefile. Another import is going to be what I call GSW. This is the global surface water data set. So if you search global surface water in your bar up there, it is this layer right here, JRC 1.4. So we click on that and we can see all the information about it. But this is from a study where people used Landsat to detect all of the water on the surface of the Earth using their algorithm. And so they mapped out where all the water was and how frequently each of those pixels were identified as water. So it's a very useful data set. I've used it quite a bit for various things. You can see the bands, there are various bands, they have occurrence. So this is the percentage of time water is present in that pixel. So you can use this data set in various ways. We're mostly going to use the occurrence band. So let me just move that again. So just go ahead and import that data set, call it GSW. And then we have a third thing, AOI, which is a polygon that I created. And it's simply a polygon that I made around the lake. And so to make this, all I did, I clicked on this thing here. You can make a new polygon. And then all is we want to be able to clip this global surface water data set just to the area that we want. We don't want any other water aside from our lake to be in our polygon. So that's all I did here. Okay, so the first thing we do in this script, we load in and display the global surface water data set. So if you run it, you'll see, I'll turn off my geometry. So there it is. And so I just displayed it, the min value, I'm using the occurrence band. An occurrence of 0 should be red, occurrence of 100% water should be blue. All right, so you see here, you're looking at our lake, most of it is dark blue, so it's there 100% of the time. But this section up here seems to be a bit more ephemeral. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. So that's why when I drew my polygon, I excluded that section of the lake because I didn't want it. But if you do want it, of course, just extend the polygon around that. Right, and so looking at the data set, we see it has all of the water. It's a very nice data set. So the next thing that we do is simply clip this data set to the area of interest that we just created. So this area of interest, just the polygon around the lake, excluding all other water bodies around it. We just run a simple clip function, and then we can display our clipped data set. And so now, since the scale has changed, you can see there's a little bit more. Some value is 80, the max is 100, just so you can see the variation in there. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to see it. The next thing you want to do is select pixels. You want a threshold of how often the pixels are defined as water. You're not going to want ones that are water only 1% of the time, probably. I mean, maybe you do. It's up to you, however you want to make the shapefile. In this case, I only want pixels that are 80%, that are water 80% of the time or more. So to do this, I simply run occurrence band to select only those that are greater than 80%. Everything else masked out entirely. So if we display that new shapefile, here I didn't even bother adding a palette. We just want to see which pixels are removed from this. So if I display this, we see some of the pixels are cut out. Wherever you see red, that area is not covered by our new 80% image here. Right, and so you can play with that value. You can make it whatever you want. It depends on your interests. In this case, I just picked 80. The next thing we need to the image, which we need to convert from raster to vector. We want every single pixel in this image to have the same value when we create the shapefile. Otherwise, it'll classify them by pixel value, and it'll create a weird, messed up shapefile. So we just create a constant image value of 1. So we've created that, and then we add that image as a band to this new image. So it's a little bit odd, but we're just making sure there's a band where every single pixel has the exact same value. So once you do that, we have to remask it because I added it to the unmasked image initially. So just remask it, exact same thing we did before. So once you have that, you can convert it from a raster into a vector. So to do that, we use this reduce to vectors function. You make sure we select the new constant value band we just created. Otherwise, it will create a feature. It'll match up pixels with the same value, and it'll assume they're part of a distinct feature, and you'll have all kinds of weird features instead of just a couple nice ones. That's why we do the constant band. So we specify our coordinate reference system. This is for the WGS84 coordinate reference system. So it's unprojected, pretty standard system. We select the scale as always, which is 30 because we're working with Landsat data. Geometry type, we just say polygon because we want a nice polygon shapefile. This, I don't know, that's just the default parameter that they want. Again, you can look at what this stuff is if we search in the docs what these parameters mean. So I don't know what this is, but that's just how it is. You can play around with that and see what happens. So once you do that, we can print our new shapefile. And so that's the only thing we printed so far. So we can see our shapefile is a feature collection of 7 elements. So since they're not fully connected at some points, like right here, there's a gap. It's created 7 unique polygons for our shapefile. But we've created the shapefile. Let's go ahead and display it on our map. And there it is. That's the shapefile that we just created. We've called it new shapefile, and it looks pretty good compared to the old shapefile. There are some differences because of our filtering on the water occurrence values. And we also clipped out this wetland-ish area up here, but it looks pretty solid. And so you can play around with it to get it to look more similar or less similar depending on your needs. This is just an example. And then of course, finally, what you want to do, last thing, very quick, if you zoom in on our new shapefile, you see that the edges are all pixelated and blocky. What you can do if you want is simplify the edges using the simplify function in Google Earth Engine. You also could export the shapefile and do it in GIS if you're more familiar with that. But we simply run this simplification feature. The value that you want to play around with here is this 100, the max error. You can increase or decrease that, and it'll change how much it simplifies things. But we run that simplification feature. We can display our new simplified shapefile. And if we look at it, we are kind of, very sharp angles here. It doesn't look particularly nice. But of course, you can smooth it out by just playing around with the 100 here. But if you want it to be simplified, that's how you do it. The very last thing you're going to do is run one more final export table to drive with the collection being your new shapefile, file format, shape, run it, a task is going to appear. Again, just like always, you do that, you let it run, name it whatever you want, and then it will show up in your drive. Beforehand, you see, here it is. The big moose shapefile, it gives you all the files you need. And you have a new shapefile. You can upload that back to Google Earth Engine as an asset if you want to, or you can do whatever you want with it. But that's all I have for you today. So those 3 scripts, if you didn't get a chance to run through them today, please make sure you try to run through them on your own after this. If you run into any issues at all, let me know. I'm happy to help. It imports all of these imports into the Google Drive folder so that you can make sure those are all correct. But feel free to email with any questions. But if you have any other questions right now, I can take them. Otherwise, that's it for today.
Thank you so much, Max. I know we're a little bit over time, but if for those who want to stay on, I'm just going to show the Python instructions really quick. And also I see Curtis asked a question about coordinate systems.
Sorry, I don't know how do I stop sharing my screen? my controls. Oh, sorry, figured it out. My bad.
Cool. I don't know if I'm the best person to answer this question, but generally different satellites publish their data with different coordinate systems. And the nice thing about Google Earth Engine is that you literally don't ever have to care about the coordinate systems, but in Python they become important. Like Google Earth Engine basically just like. Okay, so I'm gonna really quickly share my screen. So in the drive, there's this instruction thing. These were the instructions that I wrote for my 5 interns last summer. So it all worked for them last summer. And then I made sure to redo it just a couple of days ago to make sure, because the thing about Python is that there's constantly updates, things get depreciated, and things get. So here are basically the instructions I laid out in the PowerPoint, but a little bit more detailed. Basically, the only thing I wanted to note is that in the lessons, they specify Python 3.7, but Python 3.7 is now depreciated. And when and this is kind of like what it looks like, you know, they have all this stuff. And when they have you download the program Anaconda to know which packages to download, it's called environment.yml, and they have put Python 3.8 now. So it's different than the instructions, but you don't want to do Python 3.7 because it's not supported by Anaconda anymore, but you can do Python 3.9 as well. So at the risk of confusing the people who are still here, I just want to show you that when I re-downloaded this in workshop, first I changed the name. So instead of Earth Analytics Python, I called it Earth Analytics Python 2. And then really all I did was change Python, the version from 3.8 to 3.9, because I already had 3.9 downloaded and I didn't want to there is a way to like change your Python version to older version, but I didn't want to do that. And then you could, yeah. So basically that's how you give yourself this like awesome Python environment to like do basically anything you'd want to do in the earth sciences. So yeah, and also at the end of that instructions, I did put my email. So if you're like doing stuff tonight or tomorrow and you kind of run into a roadblock, just email me and I will help you as best I can so that you can have your Python environment up and working by the Friday workshop. And also, like, if you're really confused and stuck and it's late at night, ask like Chat GPT. Like AI is actually really code, and like especially when you're just like, I don't even know what to Google yet because I have this learning curve to get over. It's really helpful. But anyway, that's it. Yeah, thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you so much to both of you. I really appreciate it. I think you guys gave a great introduction in the beginning and the detailed script was awesome. So thank you, both of you, for your time. And we'll see you guys, I guess, Friday. So same time on Friday, to be continued. And until then, if you guys have questions, please reach out to Max or Carolien. Thank you so much. See you guys Friday.
See you all Friday.